The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire began with the Young Turk Revolution, which restored the constitution of 1876 and brought in multi-party politics with a two-stage electoral system for the Ottoman parliament. At the same time, a nascent movement called Ottomanism was promoted in an attempt to maintain the unity of the empire, emphasizing a collective Ottoman nationalism regardless of religion or ethnicity. Within the empire, the new constitution was initially seen positively, as an opportunity to modernize state institutions and resolve intercommunal tensions between different ethnic groups. Instead, this period became the story of the twilight struggle of the empire. Despite military reforms, the Ottoman army met with disastrous defeat in the Italo-Turkish War and the Balkan Wars, resulting in the Ottomans being driven out of North Africa and nearly out of Europe. Continuous unrest leading up to World War I resulted in the March 31 incident, the 1912 Ottoman coup d'état and the 1913 Ottoman coup d'état. The Committee of Union and Progress government became increasingly radicalized during this period, and conducted ethnic cleansing and genocide against the empire's Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek citizens, events collectively referred to as the late Ottoman genocides. Ottoman participation in World War I ended with defeat and the partition of the empire's remaining territories under the terms of the Treaty of Sèvres. The treaty, formulated at the Conference of London, allocated nominal land to the Ottoman state and allowed it to retain the designation of Ottoman Caliphate, leaving it severely weakened. One factor behind this arrangement was Britain's desire to thwart the Caliphate movement. The occupation of Constantinople, along with the occupation of Smyrna, mobilized the Turkish national movement, which ultimately won the Turkish War of Independence. The formal abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate was performed by the Grand National Assembly of Turkey on November 1, 1922. The Sultan was declared persona non grata from the lands the Ottoman dynasty had ruled since 1299. Name. The word Ottoman is a historical anglicization of the name of Osman I, the founder of the empire and of the ruling house of Osman. Osman's name in turn was the Turkish form of the Arabic name Utham. In Ottoman Turkish, the empire was referred to as Devlet-i Azamni, literally the Supreme Ottoman State, or alternatively Osmanlı Devleti. In modern Turkish, it is known as Osmanlı İmparatorluğu or Osmanlı Devleti. The Turkish word for Ottoman originally referred to the tribal followers of Osman in the 14th century. The word subsequently came to be used to refer to the empire's military administrative elite. In contrast, the term Turk was used to refer to the Anatolian peasant and tribal population and was seen as a disparaging term when applied to urban, educated individuals. 26 In the early modern period, an educated, urban-dwelling Turkish speaker who was not a member of the military administrative class would often refer to himself neither as an Osmanlı nor as a Turk, but rather as a Rum, or Roman, meaning an inhabitant of the territory of the former Byzantine Empire in the Balkans and Anatolia. The term Rum was also used to refer to Turkish speakers by the other Muslim peoples of the empire and beyond. 11 As applied to Ottoman Turkish speakers, this term began to fall out of use at the end of the 17th century, and instead of the word increasingly became associated with the Greek population of the empire, a meaning that it still bears in Turkey today. 51 In Western Europe, the names Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, and Turkey were often used interchangeably, with Turkey being increasingly favored both in formal and informal situations. This dichotomy was officially ended in 1920–1923, when the newly established Ankara-based Turkish government chose Turkey as the sole official name. At present, most scholarly historians avoid the terms Turkey, Turks, and Turkish when referring to the Ottomans, due to the empire's multinational character. History. Rise. None. Expansion and peak. The son of Murad II, Mehmed the Conqueror, reorganized both state and military, and on May 29, 1453 conquered Constantinople, ending the Byzantine Empire. Mehmed allowed the Eastern Orthodox Church to maintain its autonomy and land in exchange for accepting Ottoman authority. Due to tension between the states of Western Europe and the later Byzantine Empire, the majority of the Orthodox population accepted Ottoman rule as preferable to Venetian rule. Albanian resistance was a major obstacle to Ottoman expansion on the Italian peninsula. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of expansion. The empire prospered under the rule of a line of committed and effective sultans. It also flourished economically due to its control of the major overland trade routes between Europe and Asia. 111 Sultan Selim I dramatically expanded the empire's eastern and southern frontiers by defeating Shah Ismail of Safavid Iran. In the Battle of Caldiran, 91-105 Selim I established Ottoman rule in Egypt by defeating and annexing the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and created a naval presence on the Red Sea. After this Ottoman expansion, competition began between the Portuguese Empire and the Ottoman Empire to become the dominant power in the region. 5576 Suleiman the Magnificent captured Belgrade in 1521, conquered the southern and central parts of the Kingdom of Hungary as part of the Ottoman-Hungarian Wars, and, after his historic victory in the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, he established Ottoman rule in the territory of present-day Hungary and other Central European territories. He then laid siege to Vienna in 1529, but failed to take the city. 50 In 1532, he made another attack on Vienna, but was repulsed in the Siege of Guns. Transylvania, Wallachia and, intermittently, Moldavia, became tributary principalities of the Ottoman Empire. In the east, the Ottoman Turks took Baghdad from the Persians in 1535, gaining control of Mesopotamia and naval access to the Persian Gulf. In 1555, the Caucasus became officially partitioned for the first time between the Safavids and the Ottomans, a status quo that would remain until the end of the Russo-Turkish War. By this partitioning of the Caucasus as signed in the Peace of Amasia, Western Armenia, Western Kurdistan, and Western Georgia fell into Ottoman hands, while southern Dagestan, Eastern Armenia, Eastern Georgia, and Azerbaijan remained Persian. In 1539, a 60,000 strong Ottoman army besieged the Spanish garrison of Castel Nuovo on the Adriatic coast. The successful siege cost the Ottomans 8,000 casualties, but Venice agreed to terms in 1540, surrendering most of its empire in the Aegean and the Morea. France and the Ottoman Empire, united by mutual opposition to Habsburg rule, became strong allies. The French conquests of Nice and Corsica occurred as a joint venture between the forces of the French King Francis I and Suleiman, and were commanded by the Ottoman admirals Hayreddin Barbarossa and Dragut. A month before the siege of Nice, France supported the Ottomans with an artillery unit during the 1543 Ottoman conquest of Esztergom in northern Hungary. After further advances by the Turks, the Habsburg ruler Ferdinand officially recognized Ottoman ascendancy in Hungary in 1547. Suleiman I died of natural causes in his tent during the siege of Zajitvar in 1566. By the end of Suleiman's reign, the empire spanned approximately 877,888 square miles, extending over 3 continents. 545 In addition, the empire became a dominant naval force, controlling much of the Mediterranean Sea. 61 By this time, the Ottoman Empire was a major part of the European political sphere. The Ottomans became involved in multi-continental religious wars when Spain and Portugal were united under the Iberian Union. The Ottomans were holders of the Caliph title, meaning they were the leaders of all Muslims worldwide. The Iberians were leaders of the Christian Crusaders, and so the two were locked in a worldwide conflict. There were zones of operations in the Mediterranean Sea and Indian Ocean, where Iberians circumnavigated Africa to reach India and, on their way, wage war upon the Ottomans and their local Muslim allies. Likewise, the Iberians passed through newly Christianized Latin America and had sent expeditions that traversed the Pacific in order to Christianize the formerly Muslim Philippines and use it as a base to further attack the Muslims in the Far East. In this case, the Ottomans sent armies to aid its easternmost vassal and territory, the Sultanate of Asa in Southeast Asia. 84 During the 1600s, the worldwide conflict between the Ottoman Caliphate and Iberian Union was a stalemate since both powers were at similar population, technology, and economic levels. Nevertheless, the success of the Ottoman political and military establishment was compared to the Roman Empire, despite the difference in the size of their respective territories, by the likes of the contemporary Italian scholar Francesco Sansovino and the French political philosopher Jean Bodin. Stagnation and reform. Revolts, reversals, and revivals. Military defeats. Decline and modernization. During the Tanzimat period, the government's series of constitutional reforms led to a fairly modern conscripted army, banking system reforms, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the replacement of religious law with secular law and guilds with modern factories. The Ottoman Ministry of Post was established in Istanbul in 1840. American inventor Samuel Morse received an Ottoman patent for the telegraph in 1847, which was issued by Sultan Abdülmecid, who personally tested the new invention. The reformist period peaked with the constitution, called the Kanunu İsa'sı. The empire's first constitutional era was short-lived. The parliament survived for only 2 years before the Sultan suspended it. The Christian population of the empire, owing to their higher educational levels, started to pull ahead of the Muslim majority, leading to much resentment on the part of the latter. In 1861, there were 571 primary and 94 secondary schools for Ottoman Christians with 140,000 pupils in total, a figure that vastly exceeded the number of Muslim children in school at the same time, who were further hindered by the amount of time spent learning Arabic and Islamic theology. Author Norman Stone further suggests that the Arabic alphabet, in which Turkish was written until 1928, was very ill-suited to reflect the sounds of the Turkish language, which imposed a further difficulty on Turkish children. In turn, the higher educational levels of the Christians allowed them to play a larger role in the economy, with the rise in prominence of groups such as the Sursak family indicative of this shift in influence. In 1911, of the 654 wholesale companies in Istanbul, 528 were owned by ethnic Greeks. In many cases, Christians and also Jews were able to gain protection from European consuls and citizenship, meaning they were protected from Ottoman law and not subject to the same economic regulations as their Muslim counterparts. The Crimean War was part of a long-running contest between the major European powers for influence over territories of the declining Ottoman Empire. The financial burden of the war led the Ottoman state to issue foreign loans amounting to £5 million on August 4, 1854, 71. The war caused an exodus of the Crimean Tatars, about 200,000 of whom moved to the Ottoman Empire in continuing waves of emigration. 79–108 Toward the end of the Caucasian Wars, 90% of the Circassians were ethnically cleansed and exiled from their homelands in the Caucasus and fled to the Ottoman Empire, resulting in the settlement of 500,000 to 700,000 Circassians in Turkey. Some Circassian organizations give much higher numbers, totaling 1.5 million deported or killed. Crimean Tatar refugees in the late 19th century played an especially notable role in seeking to modernize Ottoman education and in first promoting both pan-Turkism and a sense of Turkish nationalism. In this period, the Ottoman Empire spent only small amounts of public funds on education, For example, in 1860-1861 only 0.2% of the total budget was invested in education, 50 as the Ottoman state attempted to modernize its infrastructure and army in response to threats from the outside. It also opened itself up to a different kind of threat, that of creditors. Indeed, as the historian Eugene Rogan has written, the single greatest threat to the independence of the Middle East in the 19th century was not the armies of Europe but its banks. The Ottoman state, which had begun taking on debt with the Crimean War, was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1875. By 1881, the Ottoman Empire agreed to have its debt controlled by an institution known as the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a council of European men with presidency alternating between France and Britain. The body controlled swaths of the Ottoman economy, and used its position to ensure that European capital continued to penetrate the empire, often to the detriment of local Ottoman interests. The Ottoman Bashibazuks brutally suppressed the Bulgarian uprising of 1876, massacring up to 100,000 people in the process. 139 The Russo-Turkish War ended with a decisive victory for Russia. As a result, Ottoman holdings in Europe declined sharply. Bulgaria was established as an independent principality inside the Ottoman Empire, Romania achieved full independence, and Serbia and Montenegro finally gained complete independence, but with smaller territories. In 1878, Austria-Hungary unilaterally occupied the Ottoman provinces of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Novi Pazar. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli advocated for restoring the Ottoman territories on the Balkan Peninsula during the Congress of Berlin, and in return, Britain assumed the administration of Cyprus in 1878. 228–254 Britain later sent troops to Egypt in 1882 to put down the Urabi revolt. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was too paranoid to mobilize his own army, fearing this would result in a coup d'état effectively gaining control in both territories. Abdul Hamid II, popularly known as Abdul Hamid the Damned on account of his cruelty and paranoia, was so fearful of the threat of a coup that he did not allow his army to conduct war games, lest this serves as the cover for a coup, but he did see the need for military mobilization. In 1883, a German military mission under General Baron Colmar von der Goltz arrived to train the Ottoman army, leading to the so-called Goltz generation of German-trained officers who were to play a notable role in the politics of the last years of the empire. 24 From 1894 to 1896, between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenians living throughout the empire were killed in what became known as the Hamidian massacres. 42 In 1897 the population was 19 million, of whom 14 million were Muslim. An additional 20 million lived in provinces that remained under the Sultan's nominal suzerainty but were entirely outside his actual power. One by one the Porte lost nominal authority. They included Egypt, Tunisia, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Lebanon. As the Ottoman Empire gradually shrank in size, some 7–9 million Muslims from its former territories in the Caucasus, Crimea, Balkans, and the Mediterranean islands migrated to Anatolia and eastern Thrace. After the empire lost the First Balkan War, it lost all its Balkan territories except East Thrace. This resulted in around 400,000 Muslims fleeing with the retreating Ottoman armies, and with some 400,000 non-Muslims fleeing territory still under Ottoman rule. Justin McCarthy estimates that during the period 1821 to 1922, 5.5 million Muslims died in southeastern Europe, with the expulsion of 5 million. Defeat and dissolution. Young Turk movement. World War I. Genocides. Arab revolt. Treaty of Sèvres and Turkish War of Independence. Historiographical debate on the Ottoman state. Several historians such as British historian Edward Gibbon and the Greek historian Dimitri Kitsikis have argued that after the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman state took over the machinery of the Byzantine state and that in essence, the Ottoman Empire was a continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire under a Turkish Muslim guise. The American historian Sparis Vryanis wrote that the Ottoman state was centered on a Byzantine Balkan base with a veneer of the Turkish language and the Islamic religion. The American historian Heath Lowry and Kitsikis posit that the early Ottoman state was a predatory confederacy open to both Byzantine Christians and Turkish Muslims, whose primary goal was attaining booty and slaves, rather than spreading Islam, and that only later Islam became the primary characteristic of the empire. Other historians have followed the lead of the Austrian historian Paul Wittek, who emphasized the Islamic character of the early Ottoman state, seeing the Ottoman state as a jihad state dedicated to expanding the Muslim world. Many historians, led in 1937 by the Turkish historian Mehmet Fuat Köprülü, championed the Gaza thesis that saw the early Ottoman state as a continuation of the way of life of the nomadic Turkic tribes who had come from East Asia to Anatolia via Central Asia and the Middle East on a much larger scale. They argued that the most important cultural influences on the Ottoman state came from Persia. The British historian Norman Stone suggested many continuities between the Eastern Roman and Ottoman empires, such as the Zugurian tax of Byzantium becoming the Ottoman Rizamisif tax, the prono land-holding system that linked the amount of land one owned with one's ability to raise cavalry becoming the Ottoman Timar system, and the Ottoman measurement for land, the donum, was the same as the Byzantine strema. Stone also pointed out that despite the fact that Sunni Islam was the state religion, the Eastern Orthodox Church was supported and controlled by the Ottoman state, and in return to accepting that control became the largest landholder in the Ottoman Empire. Despite the similarities, Stone argued that a crucial difference was that the land grants under the Timar system were not hereditary at first. Even after land grants under the Timar system became inheritable, land ownership in the Ottoman Empire remained highly insecure, and the Sultan could and did revoke land grants whenever he wished. Stone argued this insecurity in land tenure strongly discouraged Timurites from seeking long-term development of their land, and instead led the Timurites to adopt a strategy of short-term exploitation, which ultimately had deleterious effects on the Ottoman economy. Most of the Ottoman sultans adhered to Sufism and followed Sufi orders, and believed Sufism was the correct way to reach God. Because the matters of jurisprudence and sharia were state matters, the state-sponsored Sufi religious dominance came into play. Non-Sufi Muslims and Arabs were neglected and not given any position in the Hejaz government. Before the reforms of the 19th and 20th centuries, the state organization of the Ottoman Empire was a system with two main dimensions, the military administration, and the civil administration. The Sultan was in the highest position in the system. The civil system was based on local administrative units based on the region's characteristics. The state had control over the clergy. Certain pre-Islamic Turkish traditions that had survived the adoption of administrative and legal practices from Islamic Iran remained important in Ottoman administrative circles. According to Ottoman understanding, the state's primary responsibility was to defend and extend the land of the Muslims and to ensure security and harmony within its borders in the overarching context of Orthodox Islamic practice and dynastic sovereignty. The Ottoman Empire, or as a dynastic institution, the House of Osman, was unprecedented and unequaled in the Islamic world for its size and duration. In Europe, only the House of Habsburg had a similarly unbroken line of sovereigns from the same family who ruled for so long, and during the same period, between the late 13th and early 20th centuries. The Ottoman dynasty was Turkish in origin. On 11 occasions, the Sultan was deposed because he was perceived by his enemies as a threat to the state. There were only 2 attempts in Ottoman history to unseat the ruling Ottoman dynasty, both failures, which suggests a political system that for an extended period was able to manage its revolutions without unnecessary instability. As such, the last Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VI was a direct patrilineal descendant of the first Ottoman Sultan Osman I, which was unparalleled in both Europe and in the Islamic world. The primary purpose of the imperial harem was to ensure the birth of male heirs to the Ottoman throne and secure the continuation of the direct patrilineal power of the Ottoman sultans in the future generations. The highest position in Islam, caliph, was claimed by the sultans starting with Murad I, which was established as the Ottoman Caliphate. The Ottoman Sultan, Padishah, or Lord of Kings, served as the empire's sole regent and was considered to be the embodiment of its government, though he did not always exercise complete control. The imperial harem was one of the most important powers of the Ottoman court. It was ruled by the Valide Sultan. On occasion, the Valide Sultan would become involved in state politics. For a time, the women of the harem effectively controlled the state in what was termed the Sultanate of Women. New sultans were always chosen from the sons of the previous sultan. The strong educational system of the palace school was geared towards eliminating the unfit potential heirs and establishing support among the ruling elite for a successor. The palace schools, which would also educate the future administrators of the state, were not a single track. First, the madrasa was designated for the Muslims, and educated scholars and state officials according to Islamic tradition. The financial burden of the madras was supported by vakifs, allowing children of poor families to move to higher social levels and income. The second track was a free boarding school for the Christians, the Enderun, which recruited 3,000 students annually from Christian boys between 8 and 20 years old from 1 in 40 families among the communities settled in Rumeliya or the Balkans, a process known as devshirm. Though the Sultan was the supreme monarch, the Sultan's political and executive authority was delegated. The politics of the state had a number of advisors and ministers gathered around a council known as Divan. The Divan, in the years when the Ottoman state was still a beylik, was composed of the elders of the tribe. Its composition was later modified to include military officers and local elites. Later still, beginning in 1320, a Grand Vizier was appointed to assume certain of the Sultan's responsibilities. The Grand Vizier had considerable independence from the Sultan with almost unlimited powers of appointment, dismissal, and supervision. Beginning with the late 16th century, sultans withdrew from politics and the Grand Vizier became the de facto head of state. Throughout Ottoman history, there were many instances in which local governors acted independently, and even in opposition to the ruler. After the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, the Ottoman state became a constitutional monarchy. The Sultan no longer had executive powers. A parliament was formed, with representatives chosen from the provinces. The representatives formed the imperial government of the Ottoman Empire. This eclectic administration was apparent even in the diplomatic correspondence of the empire, which was initially undertaken in the Greek language to the west. The Tughra were calligraphic monograms, or signatures, of the Ottoman sultans, of which there were 35. Carved on the sultan's seal, they bore the names of the sultan and his father. The statement and prayer, ever victorious, was also present in most. The earliest belonged to Orhan Gazi. The ornately stylized Tughra spawned a branch of Ottoman Turkish calligraphy. Law. The Ottoman legal system accepted the religious law over its subjects. At the same time the Kanun, dynastic law, coexisted with religious law or Sharia. The Ottoman Empire was always organized around a system of local jurisprudence. Legal administration in the Ottoman Empire was part of a larger scheme of balancing central and local authority. Ottoman power revolved crucially around the administration of the rights to land, which gave a space for the local authority to develop the needs of the local millet. The jurisdictional complexity of the Ottoman Empire was aimed to permit the integration of culturally and religiously different groups. The Ottoman system had 3 court systems, one for Muslims, one for non-Muslims, involving appointed Jews and Christians ruling over their respective religious communities, and the trade court. The entire system was regulated from above by means of the administrative kanun, i.e., laws, a system based upon the Turkic yasa and tor, which were developed in the pre-Islamic era. These court categories were not, however, wholly exclusive. For instance, the Islamic courts, which were the empire's primary courts, could also be used to settle a trade conflict or disputes between litigants of differing religions, and Jews and Christians often went to them to obtain a more forceful ruling on an issue. The Ottoman state tended not to interfere with non-Muslim religious law systems, despite legally having a voice to do so through local governors. The Islamic Sharia law system had been developed from a combination of the Quran, the Hadith, or words of the Prophet Muhammad, ijm, or consensus of the members of the Muslim community, qiyas, a system of analogical reasoning from earlier precedents, and local customs. Both systems were taught at the empire's law schools, which were in Istanbul and Bursa. The Ottoman Islamic legal system was set up differently from traditional European courts. Presiding over Islamic courts would be a qadi, or judge. Since the closing of the ijtihad, or gate of interpretation, qadis throughout the Ottoman Empire focused less on legal precedent, and more with local customs and traditions in the areas that they administered. However, the Ottoman court system lacked an appellate structure, leading to jurisdictional case strategies where plaintiffs could take their disputes from one court system to another until they achieved a ruling that was in their favor. In the late 19th century, the Ottoman legal system saw substantial reform. This process of legal modernization began with the Edict of Gülhane of 1839. These reforms included the fair and public trial of all accused regardless of religion, the creation of a system of separate competences, religious and civil, and the validation of testimony on non-Muslims. Specific land codes, civil codes, and a code of civil procedure also were enacted. These reforms were based heavily on French models, as indicated by the adoption of a three-tiered court system. Referred to as Nizam-i, this system was extended to the local magistrate level with the final promulgation of the Mesali, a civil code that regulated marriage, divorce, alimony, will, and other matters of personal status. In an attempt to clarify the division of judicial competences, an administrative council laid down that religious matters were to be handled by religious courts, and statute matters were to be handled by the Nizam-i courts. Military. The first military unit of the Ottoman state was an army that was organized by Osman I from the tribesmen inhabiting the hills of western Anatolia in the late 13th century. The military system became an intricate organization with the advance of the empire. The Ottoman military was a complex system of recruiting and fief-holding. The main corps of the Ottoman army included Janissary, Sipahi, Akank, and Murtaran. The Ottoman army was once among the most advanced fighting forces in the world, being one of the first to use muskets and cannons. The Ottoman Turks began using falconets, which were short but wide cannons, during the siege of Constantinople. The Ottoman cavalry depended on high speed and mobility rather than heavy armor, using bows and short swords on fast Turkoman and Arabian horses, and often applied tactics similar to those of the Mongol Empire, such as pretending to retreat while surrounding the enemy forces inside a crescent-shaped formation and then making the real attack. The Ottoman army continued to be an effective fighting force throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries, falling behind the empire's European rivals only during a long period of peace from 1740 to 1768. The modernization of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century started with the military. In 1826 Sultan Mahmud II abolished the Janissary Corps and established the modern Ottoman army. He named them as the Nizam Sadat. The Ottoman army was also the first institution to hire foreign experts and send its officers for training in Western European countries. Consequently, the Young Turks movement began when these relatively young and newly trained men returned with their education. The Ottoman navy vastly contributed to the expansion of the empire's territories on the European continent. It initiated the conquest of North Africa, with the addition of Algeria and Egypt to the Ottoman Empire in 1517. Starting with the loss of Greece in 1821 and Algeria in 1830, Ottoman naval power and control over the empire's distant overseas territories began to decline. Sultan Abdulaziz attempted to re-establish a strong Ottoman navy, building the largest fleet after those of Britain and France. The shipyard at Barrow, England, built its first submarine in 1886 for the Ottoman Empire. However, the collapsing Ottoman economy could not sustain the fleet's strength for long. Sultan Abdulhamid II distrusted the admirals who sided with the reformist Midat Pasha and claimed that the large and expensive fleet was of no use against the Russians during the Russo-Turkish War. He locked most of the fleet inside the Golden Horn, where the ships decayed for the next 30 years. Following the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, the Committee of Union and Progress sought to develop a strong Ottoman naval force. The Ottoman Navy Foundation was established in 1910 to buy new ships through public donations. The establishment of Ottoman military aviation dates back to between June 1909 and July 1911. The Ottoman Empire started preparing its first pilots and planes, and with the founding of the aviation school in Yeşilköy on July 3, 1912, the empire began to tutor its own flight officers. The founding of the aviation school quickened advancement in the military aviation program, increased the number of enlisted persons within it, and gave the new pilots an active role in the Ottoman Army and Navy. In May 1913, the world's first specialized reconnaissance training program was started by the aviation school, and the first separate reconnaissance division was established. In June 1914, a new military academy, the Naval Aviation School, was founded. With the outbreak of World War I, the modernization process stopped abruptly. The Ottoman aviation squadrons fought on many fronts during World War I, from Galicia in the west to the Caucasus in the east and Yemen in the south. Administrative divisions. The Ottoman Empire was first subdivided into provinces, in the sense of fixed territorial units with governors appointed by the Sultan. In the late 14th century, the eyalet was the territory of office of a beylerbeyi, and was further subdivided in sanjaks. The vilayets were introduced with the promulgation of the Vilayet Law in 1864, as part of the Tanzimat reforms. Unlike the previous eyalet system, the 1864 law established a hierarchy of administrative units: the vilayet, leva/sanjak, kaza, and village council, to which the 1871 Vilayet law added the nahai. Economy. Ottoman government deliberately pursued a policy for the development of Bursa, Edirne, and Istanbul, successive Ottoman capitals, into major commercial and industrial centers, considering that merchants and artisans were indispensable in creating a new metropolis. To this end, Mehmed and his successor Bayezid also encouraged and welcomed migration of the Jews from different parts of Europe, who were settled in Istanbul and other port cities like Salonika. In many places in Europe, Jews were suffering persecution at the hands of their Christian counterparts, such as in Spain, after the conclusion of Reconquista. The tolerance displayed by the Turks was welcomed by the immigrants. The Ottoman economic mind was closely related to the basic concepts of state and society in the Middle East, in which the ultimate goal of a state was consolidation and extension of the ruler's power, and the way to reach it was to get rich resources of revenues by making the productive classes prosperous. The ultimate aim was to increase the state revenues without damaging the prosperity of subjects, to prevent the emergence of social disorder, and to keep the traditional organization of the society intact. The Ottoman economy greatly expanded during the early modern period, with particularly high growth rates during the first half of the 18th century. The empire's annual income quadrupled between 1523 and 1748, adjusted for inflation. The organization of the treasury and chancery were developed under the Ottoman Empire more than any other Islamic government and, until the 17th century, they were the leading organization among all their contemporaries. This organization developed a scribal bureaucracy as a distinct group, partly highly trained ulama, which developed into a professional body. The effectiveness of this professional financial body stands behind the success of many great Ottoman statesmen. Modern Ottoman studies indicate that the change in relations between the Ottoman Turks and Central Europe was caused by the opening of the new sea routes. It is possible to see the decline in the significance of the land routes to the east as Western Europe opened the ocean routes that bypassed the Middle East and the Mediterranean as parallel to the decline of the Ottoman Empire itself. The Anglo-Ottoman Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Bal-Taliman, that opened the Ottoman markets directly to English and French competitors, would be seen as one of the staging posts along with this development. By developing commercial centers and routes, encouraging people to extend the area of cultivated land in the country and international trade through its dominions, the state performed basic economic functions in the empire. But in all this, the financial and political interests of the state were dominant. Within the social and political system they were living in, Ottoman administrators could not see the desirability of the dynamics and principles of the capitalist and mercantile economies developing in Western Europe. Economic historian Paul Barrack argues that free trade contributed to deindustrialization in the Ottoman Empire. In contrast to the protectionism of China, Japan, and Spain, the Ottoman Empire had a liberal trade policy, open to foreign imports. This has origins in capitulations of the Ottoman Empire, dating back to the first commercial treaties signed with France in 1536 and taken further with capitulations in 1673 and 1740, which lowered duties to 3% for imports and exports. The liberal Ottoman policies were praised by British economists, such as John Ramsay McCulloch in his Dictionary of Commerce, but later criticized by British politicians such as Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, who cited the Ottoman Empire as an instance of the injury done by unrestrained competition in the 1846 Corn Laws debate. Demographics. A population estimate for the empire of 11,692,480 for the 1520–1535 period was obtained by counting the households in Ottoman tithe registers, and multiplying this number by 5. For unclear reasons, the population in the 18th century was lower than that in the 16th century. An estimate of 7,230,660 for the first census held in 1831 is considered a serious undercount, as this census was meant only to register possible conscripts. Censuses of Ottoman territories only began in the early 19th century. Figures from 1831 onwards are available as official census results, but the censuses did not cover the whole population. For example, the 1831 census only counted men and did not cover the whole empire. For earlier periods, estimates of size and distribution of the population are based on observed demographic patterns. However, it began to rise to reach 25–32 million by 1800, with around 10 million in the European provinces, 11 million in the Asiatic provinces, and around 3 million in the African provinces. Population densities were higher in the European provinces, double those in Anatolia, which in turn were triple the population densities of Iraq and Syria and 5 times the population density of Arabia. Towards the end of the empire's existence, life expectancy was 49 years, compared to the mid-20s in Serbia at the beginning of the 19th century. Epidemic diseases and famine caused major disruption and demographic changes. In 1785 around 1/6 of the Egyptian population died from the plague, and Aleppo saw its population reduced by 20% in the 18th century. 6 famines hit Egypt alone between 1687 and 1731, and the last famine to hit Anatolia was 4 decades later. The rise of port cities saw the clustering of populations caused by the development of steamships and railroads. Urbanization increased from 1700 to 1922, with towns and cities growing. Improvements in health and sanitation made them more attractive to live and work in. Port cities like Salonika, in Greece, saw its population rise from 55,000 in 1800 to 160,000 in 1912, and Izmir, which had a population of 150,000 in 1800, grew to 300,000 by 1914. Some regions conversely had population falls. Belgrade saw its population drop from 25,000 to 8,000, mainly due to political strife. Economic and political migrations made an impact across the empire. For example, the Russian and Austria-Habsburg annexation of the Crimean and Balkan regions respectively saw large influxes of Muslim refugees, 200,000 Crimean Tatars fleeing to Dobruja. Between 1783 and 1913, approximately 5.7 million refugees flooded into the Ottoman Empire, at least 3.8 million of whom were from Russia. Some migrations left indelible marks, such as political tension between parts of the empire, whereas centrifugal effects were noticed in other territories, simpler demographics emerging from diverse populations. Economies were also impacted by the loss of artisans, merchants, manufacturers, and agriculturists. Since the 19th century, a large proportion of Muslim peoples from the Balkans emigrated to present-day Turkey. These people are called muhasir. By the time the Ottoman Empire came to an end in 1922, half of the urban population of Turkey was descended from Muslim refugees from Russia. Language. Ottoman Turkish was the official language of the empire. It was an Oghuz Turkic language highly influenced by Persian and Arabic, though lower registries spoken by the common people had fewer influences from other languages compared to higher varieties used by upper classes and governmental authorities. Turkish, in its Ottoman variation, was a language of military and administration since the nascent days of the Ottomans. The Ottoman Constitution of 1876 did officially cement the official imperial status of Turkish. The Ottomans had several influential languages: Turkish, spoken by the majority of the people in Anatolia and by the majority of Muslims of the Balkans except in Albania, Bosnia, and the Megleno-Romanian inhabited Nanti; Persian, only spoken by the educated; Arabic, spoken mainly in Egypt, the Levant, Arabia, Iraq, North Africa, Kuwait, and parts of the Horn of Africa, and Berber in North Africa. In the last 2 centuries, usage of these became limited, though, and specific. Persian served mainly as a literary language for the educated, while Arabic was used for Islamic prayers. In the post-Tanzimat period, French became the common Western language among the educated. Because of a low literacy rate among the public, ordinary people had to hire scribes as special request writers to be able to communicate with the government. Some ethnic groups continued to speak within their families and neighborhoods with their own languages, though many non-Muslim minorities such as Greeks and Armenians only spoke Turkish. In villages where 2 or more populations lived together, the inhabitants would often speak each other's language. In cosmopolitan cities, people often spoke their family languages. Many of those who were not ethnic Turks spoke Turkish as a second language. Religion. Sunni Islam was the prevailing din of the Ottoman Empire. The official madhab was Hanafi. From the early 16th century until the early 20th century, the Ottoman Sultan also served as the caliph, or politico-religious leader, of the Muslim world. Non-Muslims, particularly Christians and Jews, were present throughout the empire's history. The Ottoman imperial system was characterized by an intricate combination of official Muslim hegemony over non-Muslims and a wide degree of religious tolerance. While religious minorities were never equal under the law, they were granted recognition, protection, and limited freedoms under both Islamic and Ottoman tradition. Until the second half of the 15th century, the majority of Ottoman subjects were Christian. Non-Muslims remained a significant and economically influential minority, albeit declining significantly by the 19th century, due largely to migration and secession. The proportion of Muslims amounted to 60% in the 1820s, gradually increasing to 69% in the 1870s and 76% in the 1890s. By 1914, less than a fifth of the empire's population was non-Muslim, mostly made up of Jews and Christian Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians. Islam, Christianity and Judaism. Social, political, religious structure. Beginning in the early 19th century, society, government, and religion were interrelated in a complex, overlapping way that was deemed inefficient by Ataturk, who systematically dismantled it after 1922. In Constantinople, the Sultan ruled two distinct domains, the secular government and the religious hierarchy. Religious officials formed the ulama, who had control of religious teachings and theology, and also the empire's judicial system, giving them a major voice in day-to-day affairs in communities across the empire. They were powerful enough to reject the military reforms proposed by Sultan Selim III. His successor Sultan Mahmud II first won ulama approval before proposing similar reforms. The secularization program brought by Ataturk ended the ulama and their institutions. The caliphate was abolished, madrasas were closed down, and the Sharia courts were abolished. He replaced the Arabic alphabet with Latin letters, ended the religious school system, and gave women some political rights. Many rural traditionalists never accepted this secularization, and by the 1990s they were reasserting a demand for a larger role for Islam. The Janissaries were a highly formidable military unit in the early years, but as Western Europe modernized its military organization technology, the Janissaries became a reactionary force that resisted all change. Steadily the Ottoman military power became outdated, but when the Janissaries felt their privileges were being threatened, or outsiders wanted to modernize them, or they might be superseded by the cavalrymen, they rose in rebellion. The rebellions were highly violent on both sides, but by the time the Janissaries were suppressed, it was far too late for Ottoman military power to catch up with the West. The political system was transformed by the destruction of the Janissaries in the auspicious incident of 1826, who was a very powerful military/governmental/police force that revolted. Sultan Mahmud II crushed the revolt, executed the leaders and disbanded the large organization. That set the stage for a slow process of modernization of government functions, as the government sought, with mixed success, to adopt the main elements of Western bureaucracy and military technology. The Janissaries had been recruited from Christians and other minorities. Their abolition enabled the emergence of a Turkish elite to control the Ottoman Empire. The problem was that the Turkish element was very poorly educated, lacking higher schools of any sort, and locked into the Turkish language that used the Arabic alphabet that inhibited wider learning. A large number of ethnic and religious minorities were tolerated in their own separate segregated domains called millets. They were primarily Greek, Armenian, or Jewish. In each locality, they governed themselves, spoke their own language, ran their own schools, cultural and religious institutions, and paid somewhat higher taxes. They had no power outside the millet. The imperial government protected them and prevented major violent clashes between ethnic groups. However, the millets showed very little loyalty to the empire. Ethnic nationalism, based on distinctive religion and language, provided a centripetal force that eventually destroyed the Ottoman Empire. In addition, Muslim ethnic groups, which were not part of the millet system, especially the Arabs and the Kurds, were outside the Turkish culture and developed their own separate nationalism. The British sponsored Arab nationalism in the First World War, promising an independent Arab state in return for Arab support. Most Arabs supported the Sultan, but those near Mecca believed in and supported the British promise. At the local level, power was held beyond the control of the Sultan by the Ayan or local notables. The Ayan collected taxes, formed local armies to compete with other notables, took a reactionary attitude toward political or economic change, and often defied policies handed down by the Sultan. The economic system made little progress. Printing was forbidden until the 18th century, for fear of defiling the secret documents of Islam. The millets, however, were allowed their own presses, using Greek, Hebrew, Armenian and other languages that greatly facilitated nationalism. The religious prohibition on charging interest foreclosed most of the entrepreneurial skills among Muslims, although it did flourish among the Jews and Christians. After the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was clearly shrinking. As Russia put on heavy pressure and expanded to its south, Egypt became effectively independent in 1805, and the British later took it over, along with Cyprus. Greece became independent, and Serbia and other Balkan areas became highly restive as the force of nationalism pushed against imperialism. The French took over Algeria and Tunisia. The Europeans all thought that the empire was a sick man in rapid decline. Only the Germans seemed helpful, and their support led to the Ottoman Empire joining the Central Powers in 1915, with the result that they came out as one of the heaviest losers of the First World War in 1918. Culture. The Ottomans absorbed some of the traditions, art, and institutions of cultures in the regions they conquered and added new dimensions to them. Numerous traditions and cultural traits of previous empires were adopted by the Ottoman Turks, who developed them into new forms, resulting in a new and distinctively Ottoman cultural identity. Although the predominant literary language of the Ottoman Empire was Turkish, Persian was the preferred vehicle for the projection of an imperial image. Slavery was a part of Ottoman society, with most slaves employed as domestic servants. Agricultural slavery, such as that which was widespread in the Americas, was relatively rare. Unlike systems of chattel slavery, slaves under Islamic law were not regarded as movable property, and the children of female slaves were born legally free. Female slaves were still sold in the empire as late as 1908. During the 19th century, the empire came under pressure from Western European countries to outlaw the practice. Policies developed by various sultans throughout the 19th century attempted to curtail the Ottoman slave trade, but slavery had centuries of religious backing and sanction, and so slavery was never abolished in the empire. Plague remained a major scourge in Ottoman society until the second quarter of the 19th century. Between 1701 and 1750, 37 larger and smaller plague epidemics were recorded in Istanbul, and 31 between 1751 and 1801. Ottomans adopted Persian bureaucratic traditions and culture. The sultans also made an important contribution in the development of Persian literature. Education. In the Ottoman Empire, each millet established a schooling system serving its members. Education, therefore, was largely divided on ethnic and religious lines. Few non-Muslims attended schools for Muslim students and vice versa. Most institutions that did serve all ethnic and religious groups taught in French or other languages. Literature. The two primary streams of Ottoman written literature are poetry and prose. Poetry was by far the dominant stream. Until the 19th century, Ottoman prose did not contain any examples of fiction. There were no counterparts to, for instance, the European romance, short story, or novel. Analog genres did exist, though, in both Turkish folk literature and in divan poetry. Ottoman divan poetry was a highly ritualized and symbolic art form. From the Persian poetry that largely inspired it, it inherited a wealth of symbols whose meanings and interrelationships both of similitude and opposition were more or less prescribed. Divan poetry was composed through the constant juxtaposition of many such images within a strict metrical framework, thus allowing numerous potential meanings to emerge. The vast majority of divan poetry was lyric in nature, either ghazals or qasides. There were, however, other common genres, most particularly the minavi, a kind of verse romance and thus a variety of narrative poetry. The two most notable examples of this form are the Layli and Majnun of Fuzuli and the Husn-u Aşk of Say Galib. The Siyahat name of Evliya Çelebi is an outstanding example of travel literature. Until the 19th century, Ottoman prose did not develop to the extent that contemporary divan poetry did. A large part of the reason for this was that much prose was expected to adhere to the rules of sec, or rhymed prose, a type of writing descended from the Arabic saj and which prescribed that between each adjective and noun in a string of words, such as a sentence, there must be a rhyme. Nevertheless, there was a tradition of prose in the literature of the time, though exclusively non-fictional in nature. One apparent exception was Muhayyalat by Giritli Ali Aziz Effendi, a collection of stories of the fantastic written in 1796, though not published until 1867. The first novel published in the Ottoman Empire was by an Armenian named Vardan Pasha. Published in 1851, the novel was entitled The Story of Akabi and was written in Turkish but with Armenian script. Due to historically close ties with France, French literature came to constitute the major Western influence on Ottoman literature throughout the latter half of the 19th century. As a result, many of the same movements prevalent in France during this period also had their Ottoman equivalents. In the developing Ottoman prose tradition, for instance, the influence of Romanticism can be seen during the Tanzimat period, and that of the realist and naturalist movements in subsequent periods. In the poetic tradition, on the other hand, it was the influence of the symbolist and Parnassian movements that became paramount. Many of the writers in the Tanzimat period wrote in several different genres simultaneously. For instance, the poet Namk Kemal also wrote the important 1876 novel Entibite, while the journalist Brahim Sinasi is noted for writing, in 1860, the first modern Turkish play, the one-act comedy Ser Eflenmezi. An earlier play, a farce entitled Vakii Asabi ve Havadiz I Gari B. Kefsger Ahmed, dates from the beginning of the 19th century, but there remains some doubt about its authenticity. In a similar vein, the novelist Ahmed Medat Effendi wrote important novels in each of the major movements, Romanticism, Realism, and Naturalism. This diversity was, in part, due to the Tanzimat writers' wish to disseminate as much of the new literature as possible, in the hopes that it would contribute to a revitalization of Ottoman social structures. Media. Architecture. The architecture of the empire developed from earlier Seljuk Turkish architecture, with influences from Byzantine and Iranian architecture and other architectural traditions in the Middle East. Early Ottoman architecture experimented with multiple building types over the course of the 13th to 15th centuries, progressively evolving into the classical Ottoman style of the 16th and 17th centuries, which was also strongly influenced by the Hagia Sophia. The most important architect of the classical period is Mimar Sinan, whose major works include the Said Mosque, Soleimani-Yi Mosque, and Salimi-Yi Mosque. The greatest of the court artists enriched the Ottoman Empire with many pluralistic artistic influences, such as mixing traditional Byzantine art with elements of Chinese art. The second half of the 16th century also saw the apogee of certain decorative arts, most notably in the use of Iznik tiles. Beginning in the 18th century, Ottoman architecture was influenced by the Baroque architecture in Western Europe, resulting in the Ottoman Baroque style. Nuri Osmaniye Mosque is one of the most important examples from this period. The last Ottoman period saw more influences from Western Europe, brought in by architects such as those from the Balyan family. Empire style and neoclassical motifs were introduced and a trend towards eclecticism was evident in many types of buildings, such as the Dolmabahce Palace. The last decades of the Ottoman Empire also saw the development of a new architectural style called Neo-Ottoman or Ottoman Revivalism, also known as the First National Architectural Movement, by architects such as Mimar Kemaldin and Vedatek. Ottoman dynastic patronage was concentrated in the historic capitals of Bursa, Edirne, and Istanbul, as well as in several other important administrative centers such as Amasya and Manisa. It was in these centers that most important developments in Ottoman architecture occurred and that the most monumental Ottoman architecture can be found. Major religious monuments were typically architectural complexes, known as a kulai, that had multiple components providing different services or amenities. In addition to a mosque, these could include a madrasa, a hammam, an imarat, a sabil, a market, a caravanserai, a primary school, or others. These complexes were governed and managed with the help of a Vakif agreement. Ottoman constructions were still abundant in Anatolia and in the Balkans, but in the more distant Middle Eastern and North African provinces older Islamic architectural styles continued to hold strong influence and were sometimes blended with Ottoman styles. Decorative arts. The tradition of Ottoman miniatures, painted to illustrate manuscripts or used in dedicated albums, was heavily influenced by the Persian art form, though it also included elements of the Byzantine tradition of illumination and painting. A Greek academy of painters, the Nakashani Rum, was established in the Topkapi Palace in the 15th century, while early in the following century a similar Persian academy, the Nakashani Irani, was added. Surnamei Humayun were albums that commemorated celebrations in the Ottoman Empire in pictorial and textual detail. Ottoman illumination covers non-figurative painted or drawn decorative art in books or on sheets in muraksa or albums, as opposed to the figurative images of the Ottoman miniature. It was a part of the Ottoman book arts together with the Ottoman miniature, calligraphy, Islamic calligraphy, bookbinding and paper marbling. In the Ottoman Empire, illuminated and illustrated manuscripts were commissioned by the Sultan or the administrators of the court. In Topkapi Palace, these manuscripts were created by the artists working in Nakashane, the atelier of the miniature and illumination artists. Both religious and non-religious books could be illuminated. Also, sheets for albums lafha consisted of illuminated calligraphy of tughra, religious texts, verses from poems or proverbs, and purely decorative drawings. The art of carpet weaving was particularly significant in the Ottoman Empire, carpets having an immense importance both as decorative furnishings, rich in religious and other symbolism, and as a practical consideration, as it was customary to remove one's shoes in living quarters. The weaving of such carpets originated in the nomadic cultures of Central Asia, and eventually spread to the settled societies of Anatolia. Turks used carpets, rugs, and kilims not just on the floors of a room but also as a hanging on walls and doorways, where they provided additional insulation. They were also commonly donated to mosques, which often amassed large collections of them. Music and performing arts. Ottoman classical music was an important part of the education of the Ottoman elite. A number of the Ottoman sultans have accomplished musicians and composers themselves, such as Selim III, whose compositions are often still performed today. Ottoman classical music arose largely from a confluence of Byzantine music, Armenian music, Arabic music, and Persian music. Compositionally, it is organized around rhythmic units called uzul, which are somewhat similar to meter in Western music, and melodic units called maqam, which bear some resemblance to Western musical modes. The instruments used are a mixture of Anatolian and Central Asian instruments, other Middle Eastern instruments, and later in the tradition Western instruments. Because of a geographic and cultural divide between the capital and other areas, two broadly distinct styles of music arose in the Ottoman Empire: Ottoman classical music and folk music. In the provinces, several different kinds of folk music were created. The most dominant regions with their distinguished musical styles are Balkan Thracian Turkish, Northeastern Turkish, Aegean Turkish, Central Anatolian Turkish, Eastern Anatolian Turkish, and Caucasian Turkish. Some of the distinctive styles were Janissary music, Roma music, belly dance, Turkish folk music. The traditional shadow play called Karagöz and Hasivat was widespread throughout the Ottoman Empire and featured characters representing all of the major ethnic and social groups in that culture. It was performed by a single puppet master, who voiced all of the characters, and accompanied by tambourine. Its origins are obscure, deriving perhaps from an older Egyptian tradition, or possibly from an Asian source. Cuisine. Ottoman cuisine refers to the cuisine of the capital, Constantinople, and the regional capital cities, where the melting pot of cultures created a common cuisine that most of the population regardless of ethnicity shared. This diverse cuisine was honed in the imperial palaces' kitchens by chefs brought from certain parts of the empire to create and experiment with different ingredients. The creations of the Ottoman palaces' kitchens filtered to the population, for instance through Ramadan events, and through the cooking at the yals of the pashas, and from there on spread to the rest of the population. Much of the cuisine of former Ottoman territories today is descended from a shared Ottoman cuisine, especially Turkish, and including Greek, Balkan, Armenian, and Middle Eastern cuisines. Many common dishes in the region, descendants of the once common Ottoman cuisine, include yogurt, doner kebab/gyro/shawarma, kak/tzatziki, ayran, pita bread, feta cheese, baklava, lahmacun, moussaka, yuvarlak, koft/kefs/kofta, borek/burki, rak/rakia/psiporo/psikaudia, mies, dolma, sarma, rice pilaf, Turkish coffee, sucuk, koshk, keskak, manti, lavash, kanafi, and more. Sports. The main sports Ottomans were engaged in were Turkish wrestling, hunting, Turkish archery, horseback riding, equestrian javelin throw, arm wrestling, and swimming. European model sports clubs were formed with the spreading popularity of football matches in 19th-century Constantinople. The leading clubs, according to Timeline, were Besiktas Gymnastics Club, Galatasaray Sports Club, Fenerbahce Sports Club, MKE Ankaragucu in Constantinople. Football clubs were formed in other provinces too, such as Karayaka Sports Club, Altay Sports Club and Turkish Fatherland Football Club of Izmir. Science and technology. Over the course of Ottoman history, the Ottomans managed to build a large collection of libraries complete with translations of books from other cultures, as well as original manuscripts. A great part of this desire for local and foreign manuscripts arose in the 15th century. Sultan Mehmed II ordered Georgios Amiroutzes, a Greek scholar from Trabzon, to translate and make available to Ottoman educational institutions the geography book of Ptolemy. Another example is Ali Kushji, an astronomer, mathematician, and physicist originally from Samarkand who became a professor in two madrasas and influenced Ottoman circles as a result of his writings and the activities of his students, even though he only spent 2 or 3 years in Constantinople before his death. Taqi al-Din built the Constantinople Observatory of Taqi al-Din in 1577, where he carried out observations until 1580. He calculated the eccentricity of the Sun's orbit and the annual motion of the apogee. However, the observatory's primary purpose was almost certainly astrological rather than astronomical, leading to its destruction in 1580 due to the rise of a clerical faction that opposed its use for that purpose. He also experimented with steam power in Ottoman Egypt in 1551, when he described a steam jack driven by a rudimentary steam turbine. In 1660 the Ottoman scholar Ibrahim Efendi Alzacit Tezkirasi translated Noël Duret's French astronomical work into Arabic. Serafiddin Sabuncuoglu was the author of the first surgical atlas and the last major medical encyclopedia from the Islamic world. Though his work was largely based on Abu al-Qasim al-Zarai's al-Tasrif, Sabuncuoglu introduced many innovations of his own. Female surgeons were also illustrated for the first time. Since, the Ottoman Empire is credited with the invention of several surgical instruments in use such as forceps, catheters, scalpels, and lancets as well as pincers. An example of a watch that measured time in minutes was created by an Ottoman watchmaker, Meshour Shadid, in 1702. In the early 19th century, Egypt under Muhammad Ali began using steam engines for industrial manufacturing, with industries such as ironworks, textile manufacturing, paper mills, and hulling mills moving towards steam power. Economic historian Jean Batu argues that the necessary economic conditions existed in Egypt for the adoption of oil as a potential energy source for its steam engines later in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Ishaq Effendi is credited with introducing the then current Western scientific ideas and developments to the Ottoman and wider Muslim world, as well as the invention of a suitable Turkish and Arabic scientific terminology, through his translations of Western works. See also: Turkic history, Outline of the Ottoman Empire, Bibliography of the Ottoman Empire, Gunpowder Empires, Historiography of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Index of Ottoman Empire-related articles, List of battles involving the Ottoman Empire, List of Ottoman conquests, sieges, and landings, List of Turkic dynasties and countries, List of wars involving the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Wars in Europe, The Inspection Board of Finance of Turkey, 16 Great Turkic Empires. References, Footnotes, Citations, Sources. Further reading. General Surveys. Early Ottomans. None.